were never meant to hear this. October 13th, 1899, Selkirk, Montana. A date that, if the truth were known, would dismantle the carefully polished myths America tells itself about innocence, progress, and the safety of its frontier towns. At sunrise, the Thornfield mansion stood silent, but not in the peaceful sense. It was the hollow quiet of a place that had just been emptied of its soul. 7 bedrooms, untouched. 7 neatly made beds, covers pulled tight with military precision. 7 nightgowns folded in their proper places. And yet, 7 daughters, gone. Without a cry, without a struggle, without leaving so much as a heel mark in the frost on the windowsills. The official report, sealed for nearly 8 decades under federal order, contains a single detail that should have changed the investigation entirely. Each room had been searched, not ransacked. Searched deliberately, methodically, by someone who knew the exact layout of the house. But nothing was missing. No jewels, no clothes, not even the coins the older sisters kept in their dresser drawers. That detail was never meant to reach the public. And that is where your descent begins. The deeper you dig into the disappearance of the 7 sisters, the more you see it wasn't a crime born of rage or greed in isolation. It was part of something older, something practiced, a system, one that had already taken women from other towns, other states, long before Selkirk ever heard the name of Thornfield. Gabriel Thornfield, the family patriarch, refused to speak publicly about the night his daughters vanished. The man who had arrived years earlier as a humble merchant, widowed and penniless, had since become one of the wealthiest and most influential figures in the territory. His rise was meteoric and suspicious. Wealth rarely grows that quickly without the soil being watered in someone else's blood. You must understand, Selkirk in 1899 was a town that believed in its own safety. It prided itself on order, prosperity, and refinement. And yet, that illusion would shatter before the year's end. Not because of what was seen, but because of what could never be proven. This was no random disappearance. It was a removal, an extraction, the kind of operation that leaves no witnesses, no traces, and no hope of return. And once you know how it happened, you'll understand why no one in Selkirk ever truly slept soundly again. Selkirk was the kind of place the eastern newspapers loved to romanticize. A former frontier outpost transformed into a prosperous jewel of the Northern Pacific Railroad. The silver mines in the Bitterroot Mountains had drawn money, investors, and the promise of modern comfort. But prosperity is a dangerous mask. It hides fractures, social, economic, and moral, that only the patient and the predatory can exploit. In the autumn of 1899, the air in Selkirk carried the mingled scents of wood smoke, fallen leaves, and silver dust from the smelters on the edge of town. On Main Street, freight wagons rolled toward the depot, polished boots of eastern businessmen clicked against wooden sidewalks, and families fresh from Chicago or St. Louis stepped off the trains with dreams of new beginnings. They believed they were entering a land where a man's value came from determination, not pedigree. But beneath the polished storefronts and Sunday church socials ran a quieter current, rumors about families whose daughters left for better opportunities in far-off cities, only for no word to ever come back. These whispers were dismissed by the respectable and ignored by the powerful. The official story was always neat. They married, they moved, they found work. But the truth, spoken only in kitchens after dark, was that no one could prove where they went, or if they'd ever left of their own free will. And at the very center of Selkirk's prosperity stood Gabriel Thornfield. When he arrived in 1892, he was a man carved by hardship, a widower who'd buried his wife on the trail from Ohio, arriving in winter with nothing but a wagon of dry goods and 7 daughters huddled close to the fire. The town embraced him, and in return he built them the largest store for 100 miles, securing contracts with miners and suppliers in Chicago and San Francisco. In just 2 years, he'd gone from humble merchant to the wealthiest man in 3 counties, owner of a 3-story Victorian mansion trimmed in gingerbread and stained glass. People told themselves his rise was the American dream at work. But there's a rule you must remember: rapid fortunes are rarely innocent. And as Gabriel's influence grew, so did the strangers who came into town after dark, meeting him behind the closed doors of his study and leaving before dawn. No records of their names, no explanations for their visits. And in the months before his daughters vanished, those midnight meetings became more frequent and more urgent. To understand the disappearance, you must first understand the 7 Thornfield sisters, because this was not the removal of nameless girls from a ledger. This was the deliberate erasure of a family whose faces, talents, and voices were woven into the very fabric of Selkirk's life. Margaret, the eldest at 26, was more than a schoolteacher. She was a force. Her methods broke away from rote memorization, teaching children to think, to question, to apply what they learned to the world outside the schoolhouse walls. Parents trusted her with the minds of their sons and daughters, and some whispered that her way of teaching could produce a generation too independent to be easily controlled. Catherine, 2 years younger, painted the truth of Montana onto canvas. Her work captured more than scenery. It captured the character of the people, the endurance etched into their faces, the pride that no economic depression could strip away. Her exhibitions brought refinement to Selkirk, but her art also recorded its soul, something not everyone wanted preserved. The twins, Eleanor and Elizabeth, ran the seamstress shop that clothed Selkirk's women for weddings, funerals, and every occasion between. Their shop was more than a business. It was a quiet parliament, a place where women spoke freely, shared worries, and exchanged information. Eleanor's business mind kept the operation thriving, while Elizabeth's listening ear heard more than gossip. She heard the fault lines in the town's stability. Sarah, at 20, had a voice that could shake the rafters of the Methodist Church. But it wasn't her singing alone that made her dangerous to the wrong kind of men. It was her ability to gather people together. She organized choirs, charity drives, and relief for injured miners' families. She understood that unity was power, and she wielded it naturally. Grace, 17, possessed a mind built for numbers and patterns. She managed her father's accounts with surgical precision, spotting irregularities no seasoned bookkeeper would notice. More than one businessman privately remarked she had the sharpest financial instincts they'd ever seen. And Rebecca, the youngest at 14, was beloved. She moved through Selkirk like sunlight, reading to children at the library, caring for the elderly, connecting with strangers instantly. She had a gift for making people feel seen. Together, they were the pillars of Gabriel Thornfield's public image. Their removal would not just shatter a family, it would remove a network of influence that reached into every corner of the community. And perhaps that was exactly the point. The Thornfield name carried weight in Selkirk, but with influence comes attention, the kind that watches from shadows and listens without ever revealing itself. By the summer of 1899, that attention had sharpened into scrutiny. Whispers began to circulate that Gabriel's sudden rise had not been a story of grit and luck, but of connections, powerful, invisible connections that stretched far beyond Montana. Some said Eastern investors had taken a special interest in him, using his store as a front for moving goods, and perhaps people along the railroad lines. Others noted how often well-dressed strangers arrived on the evening train, their boots too clean for mining, their coats too fine for cattle work. They came to the Thornfield mansion under cover of night and were gone before the first roosters crowed. No one in town could say who they were. No one dared ask. The country was still clawing its way out of the deep economic depression of 1893. Families across the West were desperate. In the mining camps, labor disputes had turned violent. Where the Western Federation of Miners was battling for fair wages and safer conditions, but mine owners, many hundreds of miles away, were unmoved. Armed guards, strikebreakers, and political muscle were sent in to break unity before it could grow strong enough to threaten profits. In places like Selkirk, caught between wealth flowing in and unrest simmering below, opportunity for exploitation was ripe. The newly expanded Northern Pacific Railroad was more than just a lifeline for goods. It was a vein, and those who knew how to tap it could move anything. Ore, money, secrets, and human cargo. Rumors of missing young women followed the rails like ghost stories, always explained away as marriages, jobs in distant cities, and new lives. The letters home, when they came at all, were strangely vague, and some families never received any word at all. It was in this atmosphere of prosperity laced with unease, of polished civility covering cracks in the foundation, that Gabriel Thornfield's private meetings grew more frequent. The sisters noticed. They noticed the locked study door. They noticed the voices in the night. And they noticed how their father's eyes no longer rested easily on theirs. By early October, whatever was coming was already in motion. The train schedules, the strangers, the quiet conversations, They were all converging toward one date. And when that date arrived, the Thornfield sisters would walk out of their lives forever. The last 2 days in Selkirk began without warning, or perhaps the warning had been there all along, hiding in plain sight. On the morning of October 12th, the sisters went about their routines, but each felt the strangeness in the air. The townspeople seemed to watch them longer than usual. Conversations in the seamstress shop stopped abruptly when they walked in. Margaret's schoolchildren were unusually quiet, their parents lingering at the doorway as if weighing whether to speak. That afternoon, Catherine returned from the post office with a telegram addressed to Gabriel. The paper was thin, the ink hurried. She caught only one word before her father snatched it from her hands. A consignment. His jaw tightened. Without a word, he folded it into his coat and left for the store. At dusk, the first October 13th began with a wind that rattled the shutters and carried the faint smell of smoke from somewhere far upriver. Selkirk awoke to an overcast sky, the sun veiled in a pale shroud, as if even the morning was reluctant to show its face. The sisters moved through the house quietly, each carrying a private weight. Margaret dressed for school but lingered over her tea, her eyes drifting to the clock every few minutes. Catherine packed provisions for a day's errands in town, but kept glancing toward the window, scanning for riders. Hein for riders. Even Rebecca, the most light-hearted of the seven, seemed subdued, her laughter forced. Shortly after 9, a heavy knock echoed through the house. When Eleanor opened the door, 3 men stood there, none from Selkirk. Their boots were scuffed, their coats travel-worn, but their eyes were sharp. They asked for Gabriel by name, their voices low but firm. He appeared almost instantly, as if he had been waiting. Without inviting them inside, he stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him. Through the glass, Sarah watched their lips move quickly, their gestures clipped. One man produced a folded paper. Gabriel scanned it, nodded once, and returned inside. "We'll be making a short trip today," he announced to the sisters, his tone carrying no room for argument. "Wear something suitable for travel." No explanation, no destination. Only an unspoken command that made the air feel heavier. By noon, a black carriage, finer than anything usually seen in Selkirk, pulled up to the house. Its wheels were spotless despite the muddy streets, and the driver kept his face obscured beneath a broad-brimmed hat. 2 more men, dressed in matching dark coats, descended from the rear seat. They moved with quiet efficiency, their glances sweeping over the sisters like inventory being taken. The girls were instructed to gather in the front hall. One by one, they were handed small parcels of their own belongings, a scarf here, a book there, as if someone had pre-selected what they would be allowed to bring. Margaret protested, asking why they couldn't take more. Gabriel's eyes cut to hers, cold and final. Outside, the carriage door hung open like the mouth of some great waiting animal. The sisters hesitated at the threshold, but the men's presence left no space for refusal. By the time the door shut behind them, the only sound was the slow creak of leather harnesses and the rhythmic clatter of hooves. The Thornfield mansion grew smaller in the distance, and Selkirk would never see them return. The first miles passed in tense silence. The interior of the carriage was upholstered in deep burgundy velvet, the kind that seemed to swallow light. Outside, the familiar roads of Selkirk quickly gave way to less traveled paths, their ruts filled with stagnant rainwater. The sisters shifted in their seats, exchanging glances that carried questions none dared voice. Rebecca, ever the boldest, was the first to speak. "Where are we going?" Her voice was quiet but steady. Gabriel didn't answer. He sat opposite them, his hands clasped tightly over a leather satchel. The 3 men who had met them earlier rode behind on horseback, keeping a constant formation, one to each side, one trailing just far enough back to remain in the periphery. The sky darkened, unnaturally fast. Though it was barely mid-afternoon, the light took on that strange amber quality that comes before a storm. The air inside the carriage grew warm and stale. Eleanor cracked a window for air, but as soon as she did, an unfamiliar scent drifted in, metallic, almost sweet, like old coins left in the rain. Hours passed. The road narrowed, then turned to packed dirt. Trees crowded in on either side, their branches interlacing overhead until the sky vanished entirely. The horses' hooves made dull, muffled thuds on the earth, and the only other sound was the faint, rhythmic ticking of something in Gabriel's coat pocket. When the carriage finally slowed, the sisters leaned forward, expecting to see a town or a house, but there was nothing, only a break in the trees and a narrow trail leading into shadow. The driver did not dismount. Instead, one of the mounted men rode ahead, disappearing into the gloom. Minutes later, he returned and nodded once. Gabriel stood, his voice low but firm. "Out, bring only what you were given." The sisters stepped down into the damp earth. The trail ahead seemed almost unnaturally straight, vanishing into a darkness that wasn't entirely due to the thick canopy above. Somewhere far off, a low hum vibrated through the ground, too steady to be wind, too deep to be an animal. The carriage did not follow them. It turned back the way it came, the sound of hooves fading until only the hum remained. Without a word, the men formed a loose circle around the sisters and began walking forward, into the trees that would swallow them whole. The trail twisted deeper into the forest, though strangely, the air grew warmer the farther they went. The trees here were ancient, their trunks wide enough to hide a man entirely, their bark mottled with patches of dark moss. The sisters walked in silence, their footsteps softened by a thick layer of damp leaves. That low hum still thrummed through the ground, and now it seemed to pulse faintly in time with their steps, as though something deep beneath them was aware of their presence. After perhaps half an hour, the forest opened abruptly into a clearing. At its center stood a structure unlike anything in Selkirk. A massive circular building of dark stone, its surface so smooth it looked almost poured rather than built. There were no windows, no chimney, and no visible doors, only a single arched entrance carved with symbols the sisters didn't recognize. They looked old, older than the town itself. Two more men in dark coats stood at the archway. Without speaking, they stepped aside to allow the group through. Inside, the air was cooler and carried a faint scent of burning herbs. The interior was dim, lit only by tall iron braziers whose flames flickered without smoke. Shadows danced across the walls, revealing more of those strange repeating symbols, spirals, intersecting lines, and a seven-pointed star that appeared again and again. Gabriel finally broke his silence. "You will stay here for a time, you will be instructed, and you will be watched." Margaret stepped forward, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. "Instructed? In what?" He didn't answer. Instead, a woman emerged from one of the darkened corridors. She was tall, dressed in a long, unbroken robe of deep green, her hair braided and coiled like a crown. Her eyes were a pale, icy gray, and they passed over each sister with deliberate care. "You will learn the purpose for which you were born," she said, her voice carrying a strange, resonant quality. "The time is nearer than you think." Behind her, faint and almost imperceptible, came another sound, a soft, synchronized whispering. It was impossible to tell if it came from the walls, the floor, or the air itself. The sisters exchanged uneasy glances. Whatever this place was, it was not a sanctuary. It was a design, and they were at its center. That night, the sisters were led to a narrow chamber deep within the stone structure. The walls were perfectly smooth, as if carved from a single slab. There were no windows, only a small brazier, casting an amber glow over 6 narrow cots lined against the wall. A single wooden door shut behind them with a heavy iron latch, sealing them inside. At first, they heard nothing but their own breathing and the faint hiss of the brazier's flame. But as the night deepened, the whispering began again, low, unbroken, and layered as though dozens of voices were speaking at once just beyond the stone. Rebecca pressed her ear to the wall, her brow furrowing. "It's not coming from outside," she whispered. "It's in the walls." The sound was strange. Not quite language, but not mere noise either. The cadence rose and fell in a pattern that felt almost deliberate, like a chant in a tongue they didn't know. Each time the sisters tried to focus on it, the voices seemed to fade, only to return louder when their attention wavered. Margaret sat on her cot, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. "It's not meant to be understood," she said softly. "It's meant to get inside." Hours passed. Sleep was impossible. The brazier's flame never dimmed, and the air stayed unnervingly still, as though the room was sealed from the outside world. At one point, Eleanor swore she saw the shadows on the wall shift without the flame moving, stretching upward like reaching hands before snapping back into place. Near dawn, the whispering stopped, not fading, but ceasing all at once, like a hand cutting off a bell's ring. A few moments later, the latch on the door clicked open. Gabriel stepped inside, carrying a small tray of food, flat bread, dark berries, and a clay cup filled with a thick, bitter-smelling liquid. "Eat," he instructed, setting the tray down. "Your first lesson begins when the sun is fully risen." He didn't answer their questions, didn't acknowledge their fear. He simply turned and left, the iron latch falling shut again. The sisters stared at the untouched food. Outside the brazier's glow, the walls seemed to pulse faintly, as though something beyond the stone was waiting for them to take the first bite. When the heavy latch lifted again, the sisters were ushered down a winding corridor, their bare feet brushing against cold stone, and the air smelled faintly metallic, like iron left in the rain. As they walked, the low hum from the night before returned, not through the floor this time, but inside their heads, as if their thoughts were vibrating in unison. The corridor opened into a massive dome chamber lit entirely by firelight. Tall iron braziers lined the walls, each one burning with a flame that shimmered oddly between gold and green. In the center of the room was a wide, shallow pool, filled with water so still it looked like polished glass. Symbols, the same spirals, and 7-pointed stars from the outer walls were carved into the stone around it, inlaid with some dark, gleaming metal. The robed woman from the night before stood at the pool's edge. She motioned for the sisters to approach. "You are bound to one another by birth," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally in the chamber. "Oh, but the bond is incomplete. What you carry must be awakened." Gabriel appeared from the shadows, holding a long wooden staff topped with a crystal that caught and split the firelight. Without warning, he struck the staff against the stone floor. The sound it made was impossibly deep, a single note that seemed to push the air from the room. The still water began to ripple, though nothing had touched it. The woman handed each sister a small clay cup, identical to the one from their breakfast. Inside was the same thick, bitter-smelling liquid. "A drink," she instructed. "All of you, at once." Margaret hesitated. "What is it?" "A memory," the woman said simply. "One that belongs to you, but has not yet happened." Rebecca and Eleanor exchanged uneasy glances. Still, one by one, the sisters lifted the cups to their lips. The liquid was colder than they expected, almost numbing their tongues. The moment it touched their throats, the chamber seemed to tilt, the firelight bending and the voices from the night before surging back, louder now, weaving into shapes behind their eyes. The last thing Margaret saw before darkness swallowed her was her own reflection in the pool, but the face staring back was older, and when Margaret's eyes opened, the chamber was gone. She was standing in a field of frost, the grass silver and brittle beneath her bare feet. The air burned in her lungs with every breath. Her sisters were there too, each of them scattered a few paces apart, their faces pale with confusion. But the frost-covered field was not empty. Shadowed figures stood in the distance, unmoving, their outlines blurred as if seen through water. Margaret turned toward Rebecca. "Where are we?" Before Rebecca could answer, the sky above them cracked with a deafening sound, not thunder, but something sharper, like the tearing of cloth. Through the split came a blinding light, and in it fragments of images poured down into their minds. They saw themselves much older, their faces worn and weathered, but their eyes burning with the same unyielding defiance. They were standing in another circle, this one of stone, surrounded by robed figures chanting in unison. Then the visions shifted. Eleanor saw a narrow cobblestone street drenched in rain, where she was running from faceless pursuers. Rebecca saw herself standing over a table scattered with ancient maps, her hands stained with ink and something darker. Margaret saw herself holding a small wooden box, locked and bound with 7 seals, each one glowing faintly. The frost beneath their feet began to crack, thin fractures spreading outward from where they stood. The shadowed figures in the distance began to move, their bodies bending and twisting unnaturally as they drew closer. The sisters couldn't tell if they were walking or gliding, only that with each step, the air grew colder and heavier. A voice spoke then, deep and layered, coming from everywhere at once. "The bond is forged, but the debt will be paid in blood." The frost shattered completely, and the sisters fell, not into darkness, but into the same stone chamber where they had begun, gasping for breath as though they had been underwater. The robed woman stood over them, watching with unreadable eyes. "And now," she said softly, "you understand why you are here." But Margaret wasn't sure they understood anything, only that something had been placed inside them, and it was already awake. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm that felt older than memory itself. Each morning, the sisters were roused before dawn, the cold air biting their skin as they were led to the outer courtyard. There, beneath the looming walls, they were made to walk in perfect unison, their steps matching exactly, as if their movements were being pulled by invisible threads. The robed woman, whose name they still had not been given, oversaw everything. She never raised her voice, but her presence was enough to still even the smallest act of resistance. Gabriel remained a silent shadow, always just far enough away to remind them he was listening. Ugh. They were taught to repeat phrases in a language none of them recognized, the syllables thick and heavy in their mouths. At first, the words felt meaningless, but soon they began to carry weight, not in the mind, but in the body. A single phrase could make the braziers flare higher or cause the pool in the central chamber to ripple without touch. At night, they were given tasks that felt less like training and more like testing. One evening, they were blindfolded and told to navigate the echoing corridors of the keep, guided only by a faint humming that seemed to come from deep within their bones. Another time, they were locked in separate rooms and instructed to find one another without leaving their chambers. Hours later, without fully understanding how, they had all gathered in the same place. But the most unsettling exercise came on the seventh night. They were led back to the domed chamber and told to stand in a circle, hands clasped. The robed woman placed a small, living bird in the center. Its wings fluttered weakly, eyes wide with panic. "Still it," the woman commanded. The sisters hesitated. Margaret shook her head. "We're not hurting it." "You misunderstand," the woman replied. "The stillness is not death. Stillness is dominion." Without knowing why, the sisters began to repeat the strange syllables they'd been taught. The chamber seemed to tilt again, and the bird froze, not in fear, not in pain, but as though time itself had been suspended around it. When the woman released them from the exercise, the bird took flight, unharmed. But the sisters' hands trembled. This was no mere ritual. Mere ritual. This was control, over things no human should command. And with that control came a truth none of them dared to speak. Whatever they were becoming, there was no going back. By the second week, the sisters began to notice that their training was not merely about obedience or skill. It was shaping them into something designed for a purpose they could not yet see. The robed woman never explained the meaning behind each task. One day, they would be sent into the forests surrounding the keep, told to return only when they had followed the right shadow. Another day, they were ordered to stand in the pouring rain for hours, eyes closed, until they could hear not just the storm, but the patterns within it, rhythms that felt less like weather and more like messages. Margaret was the first to notice that the corridors of the keep were subtly changing. Doorways that had once opened into storage rooms now led to hallways lined with stone carvings. Faces of people they didn't recognize, their eyes carved so deeply they seemed almost alive. Rebecca, who had been keeping mental track of the stars, realized that the sky above the keep never shifted in the way it should. Nights passed, but the constellations stayed locked in place, as though the heavens here were painted on some vast, unmoving dome. The others whispered theories when they could speak privately. Perhaps they were underground, perhaps the keep itself was not on any map they'd ever known. But Eleanor's voice trembled when she said what they had all been avoiding. What if we're not anywhere we've ever been? The question lodged in their minds like a splinter. Then, one night, the robed woman summoned only Margaret to the central chamber. The other sisters were told to remain in their quarters. When Margaret entered, the braziers were unlit, and the only light came from a faint, shifting glow at the center of the room. It wasn't a fire. It was a pool of liquid light, rippling without disturbance. "A look," the woman commanded. Margaret stepped forward and saw images forming in the pool. A marketplace she recognized from their home in Selkirk, the exact stalls and faces as they had been weeks ago. Then the view shifted to the port at Edinburgh, where men loaded cargo into a ship under moonlight. She realized she wasn't seeing the past or the future, she was seeing the now, miles away. The woman's voice was soft but absolute. "You are being prepared because the world beyond this place is moving toward an hour it cannot survive without you." Margaret's lips parted. "What happens in that hour?" "More." The woman didn't answer. She only touched the surface of the pool, and the image dissolved into darkness. The next morning, the keep was different. The air inside its stone walls carried a low, vibrating hum, like the tension before a storm. "This," she said, her voice echoing off the stone, "is the reason you are here." The chains fell away, and the doors swung open with a sound like the groaning of the earth itself. Inside was a vast chamber, lit by a strange bluish glow that seemed to have no source. In the center stood a cage, not of iron, but of some dark, shimmering metal that seemed to drink in the light. Inside the cage was a figure. At first, the sisters thought it was human, but then it moved. Its limbs were long, almost too long, and its skin was pale in a way that was not of illness, but of something that had never known sunlight. Its eyes, enormous and black as polished stone, fixed on them with a look that was not anger nor fear, but recognition. The thing smiled. Rebecca's breath caught. "What is it?" she whispered. The robed woman did not look away from the creature. "It is older than your bloodlines, older than the kingdoms you've known. It is the hand that moves unseen wars. It is the whisper in the ear of kings, and it is not alone." The creature's lips parted and a voice, impossibly soft yet sharp enough to cut through the air, spoke in a language none of them understood, yet all of them felt. The syllables struck the mind like hammer blows, carrying images, burning cities, a black sky over oceans, the collapse of towers and the bending of human will. Margaret staggered back, clutching her head. The images faded, but the dread remained. "You," the robed woman said quietly, "are the countermeasure." And in that moment, the sisters understood. They were not being trained to survive. They were being shaped to destroy. The training changed after that night. Until now, it had been grueling but survivable. Strength of body, clarity of mind, unity between the sisters. But now, the robed woman and Gabriel began shaping them with something darker, older. They were taught to move without sound, even in a room filled with glass shards underfoot. They learned to read a person's pulse just by watching the way their breath shifted. They memorized chants in a language that tasted like metal when spoken, words that made the torches flicker and the stone beneath their feet feel alive. Each sister discovered her own gift. Margaret could still the air in a room until no one could speak above a whisper. Rebecca could sense the lies inside a man before he uttered them. Eleanor, the quietest of them all, could stand so perfectly still that even the creature in the cage lost sight of her. The others had their own abilities, unspoken but felt, things that had no place in the life they had once known. But gifts came with cost. The more they used these abilities, the more they dreamed of the creature, not as an enemy, but as a voice that called to them with a strange familiarity. In the dreams, it was not caged. It walked freely beside them, speaking in that same black-eyed language that bypassed the ears and went straight to the marrow. One night, after weeks of this new training, Margaret confronted the robed woman in the torchlit corridor. "It speaks to us in our sleep." "Why?" The woman's gaze was unreadable. "Because it knows you are dangerous to it, and because it is trying to make you forget that." Margaret stepped closer. "And what happens when we're ready? When we've learned everything?" The woman's voice dropped to a whisper that seemed to echo twice. "Then you will go to it. Not as 6, not as 7, but as 1. The words made no sense in the moment, but Margaret felt them carved deep into her memory, like they were not meant to be understood yet, only remembered. There was no sign of struggle, no broken chains, no blood. It had simply left. Gabriel was waiting for them, his black eyes unreadable. "You will not see the robed woman again," he said. "From this point forward, your lives belong to the hunt." Margaret clenched her fists. "Where is it?" He turned and began walking toward the stairs. "It will find you first." The days that followed blurred into a strange half-life. The keep felt different, emptier, yet watched. At night, they heard the faint scrape of something moving along the outer walls like claws against stone. Sometimes one of them would wake to find the others standing at the window, eyes glassy, lips moving in that unearthly language. None of them remembered doing it. Then came the night of the red sky. It began with a deep vibration under their feet, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. A sound, low and rolling, swept across the land. The sisters ran to the northern battlements and froze. In the distance at the edge of the black forest, a figure stood, tall, impossibly still, its pale skin catching the light of the crimson clouds. It didn't move, yet somehow they felt it inside the keep, inside them. One by one, the sisters' breathing slowed to match its rhythm. Their hearts beat in unison, not their own, but something else's. The air between them seemed to thicken, their thoughts tangling into one shared thread. Margaret's voice came from all of them at once, 7 mouths speaking as a single voice. "We are ready." The creature's head tilted slightly, and in the echo of that movement, the sisters understood the final truth. They had never been trained to destroy it. They had been prepared to become it. And in the silence that followed, the keep's torches went out,